Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Bavarian. It is about 50 degrees right here in my apartment, and let me tell you one thing, this dev diary is incredible. I will have nothing negative to say about it, at least that is where I am currently at. Maybe as I read through it again now with you, of course, in this video that changes, but right now, let me be straightforward with you. They have made a rework to nationalism, to the nation as a whole. They have explored this topic on an incredible level of granularity and detail, and they have done an incredibly job. In Victoria 3, we are looking towards the age of nationalism to be depicted in a way that no other game has ever done it before. I am incredibly excited. I suppose the one negative thing is that this is a very long dev diary compared for other Victoria 3 dev diaries, and on top of that, we're also kind of looking towards an angle where the entire thing of revanchism is yet to be added right here. We can really only hope that that comes next year, but what they have right here is incredible. Let's just jump straight in because, like I said, this is pretty long. This is written by Victoria, you know, it is an apt name. Today I will be covering the improvements made to the culture system and to our representation of nationalism. This diary will cover several areas of interest: citizenship laws, cultures themselves, and the political movements tied to them. All of the features in this diary are included in the free update 1.10. Preface. It is the eternal misfortune of the Victoria 3 designer that one may at any moment face a task which sweeps one off one's feet and deposits one in the midst of a centuries-old debate. Any serious engagement with the topic of nationalism will inevitably force one to confront half a dozen difficult questions. What conditions permitted the rise of nationalism? How does one interpret the numerous pre-modern phenomena that invoke certain aspects of nationalism? How does one separate the claims nationalism makes about its nature from its actual nature? Why did the pre-modern melange of regional, religious or clan identities homogenize into what we call national identity? How does one define a nation, and how does one contend with all of the ambiguities which inevitably rise from that definition? Nationalism, let me be clear here, is one of the most difficult concepts that you can encounter in video game development. The reason for this is that this is a very young concept, you know, compared to something in Imperator Rome or the medieval period, and because of this, people are very invested in it. This makes it all the more difficult not only to make people happy in the depiction, but rather to also make it so that it kind of actually hits the core of the issue. These kind of considerations are very important, and I'm super happy that the Victoria 3 devs, that Victoria here is making these considerations, because that is needed to bring this up to a new level. In Update 1.10's portrayal of nationalism, we make certain abstractions and assumptions for gameplay purposes. Whilst the aforementioned questions were on our minds when developing these systems, we cannot claim to have settled them, nor can we claim to have developed the most accurate possible simulation of reality. The mechanical additions made in this update are limited in scope and developed with the themes of national awakening in mind. When developing them, we did so with an eye to giving empires something to worry about and nation-states tools with which to advance their position. I love reading this because what this means is that they understand, yes, even if we are in a position where we want to make a game that actually tells history as a story, or is inspired at the very least by it, we still have to create a game. And this needs to have a compound complex kind of, right, that goes in both ways, both in the empire way, making life more difficult for transnational empires, and then into the concept of forming and creating and upholding a nation state. Our secondary goals are to improve the strength of cultural movements in general, make nationalism feel like a genuine force in the world, and model the distinction between subjects and citizens. You're gonna see the difference between these two here quite generally in the dev diary as well. I will tell you, of course, that until now, national movements, secession movements, they are really awful, they're really stupid, and I can tell you that what they're doing here will actually massively benefit my major complaints related to, for example, colonial secessions like this. You're gonna see all of this. This is why I'm saying I am very happy with what they're doing here. This is, I want to use the word revolutionary, quite frankly, because the way it will play will change Victoria 3 national and societal gameplay dramatically. Let's talk about subjects and citizens. Now, they do want to mention that national pride, which they did mention here, you know, hey, I was injured, we now have a national enemy, think France, Germany, that kind of thing, won't be covered here. This will come later. Fair enough. Let's talk about subject and citizens instead. What is nationalism really? Nationalism is the ideology that the state should be the political instrument of the nation. A state constituted in this manner is referred to as a nation-state, and its political constituents are referred to as citizens. Nation-states may be contrasted with dynastic states, of which the Austrian Empire is a classical example. A dynastic state is one in which the state derives its legitimacy from its ruling dynasty, rather than from serving as political representative of any particular nation. The nation, as a highly abstract concept, is more difficult to define. Whilst in antiquity, the word typically referred to groups of people with common ancestry and language, the modern conception of the nation emerged only in the late 18th to early 19th centuries. Definitions of nation upheld by 19th century nationalists ranged from the objective conception, in which the nation is defined by characteristics inherent to people, such as blood, language, or lineage, to the subjective conception, in which the nation is defined by shared history and the voluntary affiliation of its members. Whilst these conceptions are often separated into ethnic and civic models of nationalism, nationalists of the period typically incorporated elements of both into their narratives. This is definitely true, and it is also something, this is kind of a shift that you can notice in the 1848-1849 rebellion in Germany. During that period, we were writing an actual constitution. Of course, they were working on this. What is the concept? Where do we come from? What are the rights of minorities? Which, of course, there were many in the German Confederation. And ultimately, they kind of came to the conclusion, hey, what we're doing here, it's complex. And it was so complex that when these minorities that they were debating about over what can be the German nation, who gets rights and such, when they were rebelling, we're talking about the Poles, we're talking about the Hungarians, the Czechs, of course, the Germans immediately clamped down and said, actually, this goes into a subjective meets objective reality. There is no civic nationalism on this kind of very removed level as it is now handled even in the modern day, right? Rather, they said, obviously, okay, they don't belong to us. This is us, they are the other, and that is the way it works. So this distinction really isn't as clean as we like to believe it to be, and this is exactly what they have here as well. Even in famously civic nationalist France, it is unlikely that the average nationalist ideologue would consider an Algerian to be a truly equal Frenchman. This is exactly such an interesting point of view, right? Obviously, France goes into, even in the modern day, into a bit of a different direction there if you compare it to Germany, for example. But the reality is indeed that you still have kind of this inherent understanding of who belongs to and who doesn't belong there, meaning that indeed this objective conception where you say, no, we cut it off here clearly, and beyond that, that is the other side, right? That is something that exists even in more civic-minded countries such as France. So the distinction isn't all too clear. For the purposes of Victoria III, nations are synonymous with cultures, which are a property of pops. If a pop assimilates into a different culture, it may be said to have become a part of a different nation. Nation-states are countries with certain citizenship laws that establish their primary cultures as the nations, which serve as the state's chosen constituency. To represent dynastic states such as Austria or the Qing Empire, we have implemented a new law, subjecthood. This right here is super cool. We basically now have a constitutional law, we have a citizenship law that matches a very reactionary mindset. By reactionary, what I mean here is indeed an aristocratic mindset, right? The nation itself is a rejected principle. This is something that was feared, of course, by all reactionaries in this context, in this period, because it's set, to basically uproot what was seen as the fundamental kind of constituent part of what is ruled and who are the ruled and who is the ruler, in this case indeed subjecthood. What can we see here? We see authority, we see support, separatism, strength and resistance. This is related to an interaction. We're going to learn more about that in a second, so you're going to see assimilation goes down, then of course you get acceptance from primary culture and all that stuff. It is then very heavily related to homeland, but we're going to see this actually when we get to it, so I don't need to explain this any further. But you can see that things clearly change. There are more language and heritage factors, and then at the same time we're talking about the homeland. Let's move on. Under subjecthood, the acceptance of a pop is determined largely by where said pop lives. A country with subjecthood grants pops of all cultures 30 acceptance if they live on their homelands. Combined with no colonial affairs, which now also grants a bonus to acceptance from homelands, one may increase this value to 40. Subjecthood is the new default law for unrecognized powers and certain European countries that have not adopted the nation-state model. It is limited to monarchies and theocracies and is strongly opposed by liberal interest groups and political movements. Subjecthood requires that the legitimacy of the state is derived from the sovereign rather than from the consent of the governed, a notion inimical to liberalism. I think that makes perfect sense, right? And we can see this right here as well. If we scroll down, we can see that liberal now, so the classic idea of this in, the 19th century, strongly opposes multiculturalism, ethno-state and subjecthood. We are talking about the baseline level indeed of nationalism here in European countries. The previously existing citizenship laws ranging from ethno-state to multiculturalism have been reframed to represent various definitions of citizenship. A country with a non-subject citizenship law can be assumed to recognize the principle of popular sovereignty in some form, whether it be through the monarch claiming status as personification of the nation, or a republic ruled by representatives who claim to serve the popular will. Both of these were, of course, in use in this time period in the nations or in the countries, in the regions that had nationalism as a concept on a deep societal level. We will take a closer look at the refurbished citizenship laws when we cover the cultural traits rework. Let's instead talk about cultural fervor. Cultural fervor is the measure of the national consciousness of a given culture. To reference Benedict Anderson's conception of the nation in his Imagined Communities, it is a measure of the degree to which people of a given culture imagine a community shared by all who possess that culture. Cultures in Victoria III are broad abstractions, encompassing thousands of local variations. If, in 1836, two people from Tyrol and Banat, both represented by the South German culture, were to meet, they would likely have some difficulty understanding one another, and notice marked differences in each other's home lives. At a low level of cultural fervor, they would likely default to identifying by particular regions or whatever other identifiers they may hold dearest. As cultural fervor increases, however, they would be more inclined to refer to themselves as members of a nation, considering regional identity to be secondary to this sense of nationhood. The Tyrolean and the Banater thus become South Germans. This right here is so cool. Without needing to break up cultures, right? There was this concept where we sit down and we have a variety of cultures and then they unify as nationalism comes along. That was rejected. I know a couple of mods did it, but you don't need to do that anymore, because just because everybody is South German doesn't stand there as, hey, I actually understand myself as a South German. If you can take a look at this right here, indeed, the fervor now plays a massive role. The identification with South German and later of course German as a nation is incredibly vital to get that going and to actually unify these kind of, different regions into one understanding. This is something I think that we today, very much in Europe, I think at the very least, underestimate. We kind of know, of course, that in Germany, that in other countries as well, there are various difficulties between the different regions, but realistically we all say, but yeah, it is German. I know there are some polls where like, oh, do you identify with the region, with Europe, with Germany first? Let's put all that aside. Our understanding from where we started in, let's say, 1700 is a completely different one. None of those polls do reflect this, because it is a question that you couldn't even ask at the time because it wasn't conceived this way. This changes things massively. It makes a reactionary playstyle so much more interesting, because all of a sudden you actually are competing with something that is on the rise, something that is coming, and it's not just political participation, it is an understanding of a nation. Super cool. This is the South German favor in an example. Current is 20, it goes to 31, rises up by 0.11 per month, and the target is 31 due to. So high literacy does it, having academics, so an intelligentsia, an actual intellectual elite that wants to bring you together as a nation, that wants to create a myth, that maybe wants to find objective conceptions of where you are, belonging together, culture and so on, but then also, of course, has a literary canon. We're talking about things such as a shared history, especially wars and suppression, that kind of thing. This is awesome that this actually comes in there. Building universities now in those regions can be very dangerous. What else do we have? We have from an average acceptance of 92, so the higher it is, the lower this goes, +7 from being primary culture in 3 independent countries affected by different citizenship laws enacted. So the more nation state your culture is, the more will this impact people in your culture in general, including in the nation state, but also outside of it. +1 from being primary culture in a country with an applicable education institution. So this right here would be public schools, mostly, I guess. Really cool. The standardization as we now take them for granted, the way that we perceive the world, is insanely new. And overlooking this kind of stands in the way of having a good system, which is why this, not overlooking it, is so huge to me. Let's talk about cultural fervor and the causes in greater detail. Fervor is affected by numerous conditions, conveniently listed within the fervor concept. All fervor effects are applied based on how many pops of a given culture they apply to. For example, if 10% of South German pops live in a South German country with ethno-state, and 90% live in a country with subjecthood, the South German culture will receive +2 fervor. So I assume it's basically the percent that lives in you times 2 for ethno-state, probably times 1 for non-subjecthood, at least for general non-subjecthood, maybe times 0.5 for multiculturalism, right? And then nothing coming out of subjecthood because they don't understand themselves as a nation. They are unified thanks to the sovereign rather than thanks to their shared identity. Let's take a look at this. This is fervor. Fervor is a measure of the national spirit of a culture. Pops of a culture with high fervor will assimilate more slowly, form more radicals when conquered, increase liberty desire, and be more likely to join cultural movements. The following conditions increase fervor. The following conditions increase fervor: being a primary culture of an independent country with an applicable citizenship law. And look at this, actually, I was pretty much correct, except I assumed that national supremacy and racial segregation and cultural exclusion would all give like +10. It averages out in +10, and then indeed multiculturalism actually gives 0, so there you go, right? So this is the doubling effect. This is 1.5, this is 1, and this is 0.5. Interesting. Number of casualties of this culture in war. That's pretty crazy. Okay, that's super interesting. The strategy where you send your minorities to die in the front lines no longer works unless you really want to upset them. Very cool. Having high average literacy makes sense. They're more interested in a broader concept. Number of academics pops of this culture. Again, we already talked about this. Cool. Pops of this culture resident in countries with nationalism or pan-nationalism technologies. Also cool. Being a primary culture of a country with an applicable education institution, and other culture released as independent countries. The following conditions decrease fervor. Oh, so this even isn't just ×0, it is decreasing it. Interesting. Being a primary culture of a country with a multiculturalism law, and having high average acceptance, because then you don't really need to worry about being a part of a nation. These conditions serve to abstract trends such as the development of a vernacular literary culture, the national mythologies that emerge around devastating conflicts, efforts by academics and state functionaries to construct a unifying history of a nation, and the role of public school systems in creating an official expression of a culture. One may also note that many of these conditions depend upon the existence of an independent state with a given primary culture. An exclusionary nation-state, which defines a clear in-group and out-group, is the most powerful tool that a culture has to transform itself into a nation. A freshly independent state may find itself wishing to enact a highly restrictive citizenship law in order to quickly raise the fervor of its primary culture and reap then the benefits of a nationalistic populace, both within and without its borders. Likewise, an empire which seeks to pacify a large population of a given culture would best keep a close eye on any country which has that primary culture, lest that country contribute to separatism within its borders. This is so cool. You essentially get something to do for reactionaries, for nationalists, and later on want to deal with this and even have a reason to go for ethno-nationalism in the late game, if that makes it so that you can rile up the people everywhere outside of your country. Once we have revanchism, which again sadly we're not getting this patch, but once we have that, we can then actually also just go the full mile and essentially say, hey, this will make it so that I can, well, let's call it World War II, right? That we can go ahead and start something extreme because nationalism, national fervor, or rather cultural fervor, has been whipping itself into a frenzy like crazy. A more complete example: a large number of Irish pops move to the United States, where they become literate and get recruited as academics by university buildings. The fervor of the Irish culture thus increases, and Great Britain experiences effects from increased fervor amongst its Irish population, such as increased pop attraction and activism from the Irish national movement. These are the Fenian raids. This is something that did happen historically. It took place like this. I talked about it in the Canada series. Really, really cool stuff. Let's talk about cultural fervor effects. The fervor of a culture has effects on both pops and countries. Pops with high cultural fervor become resistant to assimilation and are more inclined to join cultural movements, both majority and minority. Cultural minority movements representing a culture with a high fervor have bonuses to their baseline activism. Coupled with a new obstinance function of movements, more on that in a second, this makes unappeased cultural minority movements much more impactful upon a country. Let's take a look at this. Assimilation from Irish to Yankee. Since the peasant Irish have a high enough acceptance, live in an incorporated state, and do not consider Massachusetts a homeland, they are assimilating. Times 0.99 multiplier based on radicals and 0.61 base rate for Irish due to 38 fervor. Interesting. A high fervor primary culture serves as a boon to a country in times of war, and not just domestic politics in a nationalistic direction. High cultural fervor on a primary culture reduces the rate at which war support declines, and under non-subjecthood citizenship laws increases liberties a desire gain. Primary culture pops with high cultural fervor are also more inclined to join cultural majority movements, funneling them away from troublesome opposition political movements, pressuring their interest groups and increasing the rate at which ethno-nationalist politicians appear. This is huge. This makes it so that there's a really big reason, not sure that it is, beats out just growth, like economic growth, because I'm running out of pops, but this makes it so that there is a massive reason that me, might want to look into restrictive citizenship laws even in the late game. By maintaining discriminatory citizenship laws, one may render the privileged sections of one populace politically inert. Very, very cool. Let's take a look at this. Suffered, of course, the losses right there. 0.4 from fervor of French primary culture. This will not currently go down because there aren't enough casualties and we have a solid 0.4 of fervor. This yet again adds a massive change, especially to late game wars. I want you to think about this in the greater picture. Clearly Victoria 3, and I am saying this by the way, as this video goes live, I will be in a plane to Stockholm where they will be telling me about Victoria 3. But clearly Victoria 3 has a future, because this feature so self-evidently ultimately then has the culmination of nationalism, which is World War I directly at the doorstep. All of a sudden, you are kind of falling in line. We call it the Burgfrieden, of course, where we all agree, hey, it's World War I, we have to stick together, we won't really play opposition, we will grant the army more funds, yada yada yada. And then simultaneously, we want the war to keep going because we believe that the French have to be destroyed. This is awesome. I really like where this is going. This is intense. You could end up with wars that last for 4 years, 5 years with massive losses, you know, of course, in the trenches, just because you're not looking at a situation where if you have 100% fervor, that is a massive increase, and your war support won't start dropping until you have an unbelievable amount of casualties. I absolutely love this. Here we also have Hungary. Take a look at this right here from Fervor of Hungarian primary culture, right? The liberty desire here rises significantly. Once you have a national awakening, haha, I get it, the DLC, you will then have to deal with them. This surely could also be translated into colonial states, but obviously that is after the period of the game. Additionally, AI countries with high fervor primary cultures become more bold and aggressive when seeking to capture claims, seek independence from their overlords, or humiliate rivals. On the domestic front, they become more inclined to adopt a nationalist domestic political agenda. Let's talk about something more in the background, I guess. Cultural traits rework. Pretty simple in this case, but it does, of course, have a bigger impact. In Update 1.10, the discrimination traits possessed by each culture have been standardized. By default, each culture now has 2 traits, a language trait and a heritage trait. These traits are contained within larger trait groups. In effect, this means that each culture now has 4 traits of varying relevance, representing a culture's closer and more distant relatives. So we have the Guarani culture here. This one is indigenous American and then only shared by Guarani. So if you share a trait, that of course brings you much closer. If you at least share a trait group, brings you somewhat closer. Same thing here goes for the languages, where you don't have anybody in the direct trait, but of course in the group you have the Amazonians and the Tupinamba as well. Cool, so there are no more layers. Cultures may also gain or lose tradition traits, which represent traditional ties between cultures and provide bonus acceptance. For example, the new Eastern German culture, representing Baltic and Volga Germans, possesses the Russosphere. The Russosphere trait is shared by Russians, Tatars and others, meaning that Eastern Germans living in Russia will have much higher acceptance than their North or South German cousins, because obviously they are quite removed, they're not quite the same, and because of this you have a completely different experience. This is traditions right here, so you're getting something new there, and these traditions can gain or lose, or rather cultures can gain or lose these traits, meaning we have more flexibility in how cultures develop as well. I wonder if I am for a very long time in a subject state, could that mean that that culture then gains the tradition as well, right? Like Austrosphere? That would be kind of cool, actually. That would make playing reactionary kind of worth it. Let's say 30, 40 years, maybe a bit long. Let's say 10 to 30 years, somewhere around there. And that then impacts whether this tradition is added or removed. That would be pretty neat. Yeah, you can see right here who has it: Bashkir, Kalmyk, Tatar, Russian and Eastern German. Religious traits have been updated to work in a similar way. The Catholic religion, for example, now has the Christian trait, which belongs to the Abrahamic trait group. Makes sense, right? They updated it as well. The systems of traits and trait groups allows for laws to discriminate against cultures and religions incrementally more or less based on their proximity to the state religion or culture. The citizenship and church and state laws have been amended to incorporate these broader range of possibilities. In general, cultures with shared traits are more accepted than those with shared trait groups, which are more accepted than those with no commonalities at all. Sorry, this is such a long text. I am melting, by the way, but I think we don't need to go over the details here. Again, we're going to get to this interaction, right? That makes perfect sense. Everything else here, yeah, it is now much more incremental. I will never read any of these stats because I think intuitively we all understand exactly where this goes. Like, how does this work? Most notably, we get -10 primary culture fervor from laws. Here it's +10, +5, +15, and +20, as already discussed previously. -10 is pretty heavy. Let's talk about movement additions. In Update 1.10, we have made several changes to political movements with a special focus on identity-based movements. Like I said, those were trash. Completely broken. Secession sucked. I would not recommend them. This was massive pain in my behind because I tried to do something interesting with the Ottomans in Austria and you just physically could not do it. This rework, Thank God it's coming, because it changes a lot. Our objective with these changes is to make identity-based movements feel like powerful actors, which present a relevant threat to multinational empires. Let's take a look at this. Polish national movement, they are currently causing obstinance. Okay, interesting. Factors attracting pops to this movement: high cultural fervor, discriminated against, legacy of the Commonwealth, so this is it's something, I guess, that is a tradition. I assume that is a tradition, actually. Academics, clergy, clerks, and servicemen. Let's talk about obstinance. Super, super cool. Since Update 1.8's political movement rework, we have faced a persistent issue in which political movements have no intermediate state between passivity and insurrection. This issue especially affects cultural movements. In Update 1.10, cultural and religious movements will have a new intermediate state: obstinance. Obstinance represents pops supporting a cultural movement or religious movement within a state, passively refusing to comply with the country's institutions. Obstinance is caused by the movement activism of an applicable movement exceeding protesting, so 50%. The amount of obstinance is equal to the fraction of the state's workforce that are members of an obstinate political movement. The presence of obstinance in a state inflicts a number of negative local status effects on a state, such as reduced assimilation, tax collection, conscription, and institution impact. All of a sudden, the decree for violent suppression might be good, even in cooperated states. Obstinance represents civil disobedience and the formation of a para-state structures amongst excluded communities in certain regions. Obstinance is distinct from radicalism. Radicals of a certain culture may contribute to activism, but a pop does not need to be radical in order to contribute to obstinance. The level of obstinance generated by a movement is tied to its supporters, meaning that the most politically advanced sections of certain cultural or religious groups will tend to become obstinate first. A culture without a political movement representing its interests is much less about to exert power than a fully organized one. Any cultural or religious movement that is made insurrectionary will also necessarily be obstinate, weakening the state in the build-up to insurrection. Pictured, Great Britain's actions have angered the Irish national movement, and they have responded by rendering Ireland ungovernable. Russia has made the same mistake in Poland. Think about this. And they actually have a great example here. Victoria has an amazing example here. So she definitely kind of looked at history, quite literally, and just drew exactly what is needed to recreate those circumstances. I can already see, by the way, that Prussia here is going for Austria. Interesting. Okay. Multiple movements at the same time are capable of causing obstinance. Here in Austria, which has made several poor decisions, is experienced obstinance from the Czech, Polish, and Italian national movements, all at the same time. Historically, in the period following the Austro-Hungarian Compromise and prior to the First World War, the Bohemian Diet was frequently gridlocked by conflicts between Czech and German nationalist parties, leading to the rise of a para-state institution. Following the dissolution of the Bohemian Diet by imperial decree in 1913, these para-state bodies acquired more legitimacy than the Austrian administration in the region, culminating in Czech independence at the hands of the Czech National Committee. In game terms, Bohemia was rendered ungovernable by obstinance generated by both German and Czech national movements. Similar phenomena repeated across the Austro-Hungarian crown lands, leading to the disintegration of the empire. What we have right here, we got minority rights movements, we got Czech, North Italian, and we got Polish. Super, super cool. This is awesome. This is insane. These movements didn't matter. When they rebel, it doesn't matter. The way it works now matters. They actually are in a position where it matters. I am very cautious still when it comes to the actual civil wars, the secession wars. How do you make them impactful? They are so small, like these countries often are so small, their market is new, they're in a bad state. Unless there is a lot of foreign funding, I can't see it happening. But the movements themselves, long before they rebel, will be incredibly negative towards you. That is massive. I love it. Let's take a look at this. Obstinance in Lombardy. What do we see? 6.3% from these pops are supporting the movement. Minus 15% tax collection, minus 15% assimilation, minus 50% conversion, minus 31% impact of institutions. That is crazy. And many, many fewer conscriptable battalions. This is such an awesome change. Nationalism, finally, and it's, by the way, we're not even at the end of that yet, it's even better, but nationalism finally actually will impact you massively and negatively. Gone hopefully are the days, especially if you are reactionary, where you can just have a ton of really angry people, because all of a sudden what that will mean is that you have obstinance and none of your country will work, even if otherwise you, for example, have a police institutions. Mind you, this isn't the same as radicalism, but it definitely plays into each other. Super cool. And this is also cool. Movements spill over. Another improvement we have made to updates in 1.10, in update 1.10, is allowing them to have effects over borders. A movement becoming insurrectionary causes an uptick in activism amongst all movements in neighboring countries of the same type. For example, if a Polish national movement in Russia becomes insurrectionary, the Polish national movements in Austria and Prussia will also see increased activism. Talk about 1848, 1849, yeah? What do we have right here? We have this over here. Fervor is obviously high, plus 15% from neighboring countries with an insurrectionary movement of its associated culture. Crazy. Really, really crazy. This effect also applies to ideological movements. If a communist movement in France becomes insurrectionary, neighboring communist movements in Belgium, Spain, Italy and Germany will escalate their agitation. Additionally, ideological movements have an increased chance of spawning if its creation requirements are fulfilled, and a neighboring country of higher prestige also has this movement. Awesome. Really cool. This is awesome. This is just really good. We are getting to a point of the internationalization of domestic politics. They impact one another, they play a role with one another, and they have it both for cultural movements and for ideological movements. This is cool. This is awesome. It gets even better, of course. So this has spread from Austria to Saxony, right? Other changes. An astute observer may notice that new modifiers are present in the above citizenship laws, support separatism strength and support separatism resistance. These modifiers pertain to the new support separatism diplomatic action. Damages relations, okay, makes sense. Increases the pop attraction and movement activism for cultural minority movement, political movements of our primary culture. We can now, instead of clicking a one-off button that really sucks for Italy, we can now just do this generally. We can spread nationalism across the border into realms that are absolutely hostile to that idea. Now there's a really good reason to be any international kind of, or not international, subjecthood-based empire that is multicultural, you know, in its makeup, even not in the rights that are given, of course, but then you can impact this, you can harm them without actually needing to wage a war, without needing to dissect them directly. They may yet implode. I haven't seen anything from like a general measurement. I assume the Ottomans are getting content, right? Surely it's the Balkans update. I haven't seen anything specific about like, hey, this is how empires can fall apart if they're subjecthood based. But this is cool. This is awesome. The support separatism interaction is unlocked by researching nationalism and increases pop attraction and activism of cultural minority movements in the target country. The strength of this interaction is scaled by the difference between the prestige of the initiating country and the target country, and any support separatism strength resistance modifiers in play. As one can see above, ethno-states have bonuses to the strength of support separatism, but are vulnerable to it in turn, whilst countries with multiculturalism are more resilient to separatism at the cost of a little ability to promote it in turn. Support separatism may be countered by expelling the initiating country's diplomats, suppressing the affected movement, or enacting laws which reduce the movement's activism. Pictured Romania, which has enacted ethno-state, is supporting separatism in Hungary. Its efforts are causing obstinance amongst Romanian pops in Transylvania. What do you want to say? That's amazing. That's insane. The changes here are entirely good. Nationalism is a complex topic, but the way it is approached here, the way that you get consciousness, the way that fervor is built up and then can be weaponized is insane. I love it. I cannot wait to make this into revanchism, to take this into a direction of course, having Erbfeindschaft and that kind of thing. Defining nationalism would be awesome as well. I would love it if we could say, for example, for the Greeks, this is a big choice, right? Are we Romans or are we Hellenistic Greeks? Who are we? Where are we going? Where are we coming from? If that ever became a thing, well, let me tell you, this right here is the fundament. What they are building here is great. Way more than I anticipated from a narrative DLC. I was insanely cautious about this because I said to myself, hey, the mechanical DLC that we got for Victoria 3 came out, of course, balancing, but it was amazing. The changes made were incredible. What are the chances that they're going to add like significant mechanical reworks in the narrative DLC? And the answer is, apparently the chances are very high, because we're getting it. Insanely cool, I love it. To finish things off for today, we have improved the Promote National Values decree. It is now unlocked by researching the nationalism technology and may force pops living on their homelands to assimilate into the primary culture. Assimilation, conversion, assimilation in homeland states allowed. Very cool. Conclusion. Update 1.9 and Charters of Commerce included a selection of features with great interoperability. This style of development, in which each mechanic interacts with every other mechanic, served as our objective for Update 1.10's gameplay as well. Citizenship feeds into fervor and discrimination, which feed into cultural movements, which may induce obstinance or kick off a powerful chain reaction of secessions. Hopefully. This is my big question mark. An aspiring nation-state is incentivized to increase its fervor as much as possible, driving cracks into the great empires through nationalist struggles. An empire finds itself in a careful balancing act, seeking to minimize fervor and appease its various nationalities, enough to avoid its territories being split by civil disobedience or secession. To present one final example, the Ottoman Empire brings its protectorate of Serbia into a war, leading to high casualties amongst Serbian pops. Those casualties, coupled with the Serbian state's efforts to educate its populace, raise Serbian fervor, funneling Serbian pops in both the Ottoman Empire and Serbia into cultural movements and increasing the liberty desire of Serbia. If Serbia were to act on its increased liberty desire and launch an independence war against the Ottoman Empire, it would benefit from lower war support decay. In between building its liberty desire and launching its war, Serbia may also use the support separatism action to further increase the activism and pop attractiveness of the Serbian national movement in the Ottoman Empire, possibly generating obstinance in Ottoman territories or causing a secession it is well positioned to capitalize upon. And that is all. I have nothing negative to say. This is outstanding. I really only hope that secessions are actually dangerous, but the mechanics here are cool. They're amazing. That's it. I'm excited. How long was this? 36 minutes. See, the CK3 long dev series are way worse than this, but this was obviously long. Folks, this was amazing. I loved it. I hope you loved it as well. If you find any negatives that I have overlooked, let me absolutely know, but I love it. I'll see you later, alligator. See you in hell, buddy.